Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thanks for joining our weekly live discussion. Today's topic is how to rescue a digital transformation gone sideways. So, if you're involved in any sort of VRP implementation, an AI implementation, any sort of enterprise tech implementation, if you're sensing there might be risk, there might be problems on the horizon, and or you're trying to figure out how to get your project back on track, this is the discussion you won't want to miss. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys, including helping clients remediate some of their challenge projects that have gone off track. So, thank you again for being here today. I'm actually joining you here from a hotel room in Wisconsin in the United States, but I'd love to hear where you're joining from today. So, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat what city and country are you joining from today? We always tend to draw in a global audience, so I always love to hear where everyone is joining from today. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat which city and country are you joining from today? Love to hear from you and learn more about where it is you are today. So today's topic again, how to rescue a digital transformation. We're going to take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions along the way, I'm watching all the live stream here today from all the various platforms. We're streaming to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, TikTok, etc. So wherever you're joining from today, I can see you in the chat. I'd love to hear any comments or questions that you have along the way. I'd love to hear your feedback too. If you're having any challenges that you're struggling with, or you have questions about how to address any risks you're seeing in your digital transformation, or if you just want to share some of the lessons you might have from having been through projects like these before, I'd love to hear your feedback as we go through the conversation here today. So a couple of quick things before we jump in. First of all, I wanted to. I have a question here for the audience before I jump in. I would love to hear from you what the biggest challenges that you're facing in your digital transformation today. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. I'm going to walk through today some steps on how to remediate a failed or troubled project. And I guess the first thing before I jump in, and again, I'll keep an eye on the chat to see what comments you have. What are the biggest challenges you've seen in your digital transformation experience, or perhaps you're going through one now, and you'd like to share some experiences you have there. I'd love to hear your feedback. But one of the interesting things about digital transformations that maybe is good news and bad news is that most statistics peg failure rates of digital transformations right around 80%, and that's been a remarkably steady number over the last several years. So if you go back decades, actually, from when I first started my career in this space, I remember 80% being the published or the common number you would see from Gardner or McKinsey or whoever would put out a study about digital transformation failure. In fact, I've done my own research over the years and found the same to be true. And what's interesting is that technology has advanced so much over the years, and in some ways, digital transformations, in theory or on paper, should be going a lot more smashingly than they are now. You would think that with better technology, better tools, more flexibility, more options, you would think that would lead to a higher success rate, but that just has not materialized. In fact, I would argue and submit to you that failure rates are actually increasing and are bound to continue increasing for the simple fact that the gap or the chasm between what organizations are capable of today versus what technology can do tomorrow, that gap is widening so greatly that it's creating a bigger chasm or a bigger jump that organizations need to make. And with that increased jump or that increased chasm comes increased risk and increased likelihood of failure. So it's not necessarily intentional. Obviously, the tech industry, I don't believe, is trying to make it more difficult to implement new technologies, but they're advancing so quickly and exponentially that organizations simply can't keep up. There's just too much inertia. There's too much slow movement at big organizations, especially. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. That's just how bigger organizations or organisms work. But the the fact of the matter is how do we pivot when we run into trouble? I think the biggest challenge that organizations have in these digital transformations, and the biggest challenge that failures have often, is that they don't recognize the problems in time. They ignore the problems. Maybe they're just not aware. Maybe they have third parties that have a vested interest in seeing them continue down the same path of failure rather than succeeding. Because let's be honest, the ones that benefit if you fail, if you're an organization going through a digital transformation, The only ones that benefit are the third party consultants. They actually benefit economically if you fail or if you struggle because you're going to need more of their time and they're going to have to throw more bodies, more resources, and generate more revenue as a result. So that's the challenge that is sort of a conflict of interest in the digital transformation space. And I think that's a real problem that I don't have an answer to or a good solution for you, but that is the reality of it. So that's the context for digital transformation failure. And what I want to do today is share with you a bit more of a framework and just some steps to walk through to get your digital transformation back on track. Now, before I jump into the conversation, just to say hello to our audience or address a few comments that have come in here. Sheriff Fred from Cairo, Egypt on YouTube. Thanks for being here today. Ms. Talk from Slovenia is joining us on LinkedIn. Thank you for being here today. Christina is joining us on LinkedIn from London in the UK on LinkedIn. Darian's joining us on LinkedIn. Thank you for being here today. Bipin from Mumbai, India is here today. We have someone joining from Atlanta, Georgia. I don't see the name there. I apologize for that. And thank you for everyone who commented here. So I appreciate that. And then just a couple early comments that we've gotten here from my question of what causes some of the challenges in your experience or in your opinion. Sheriff Fried from YouTube says recruiting the right people for the project is probably the biggest challenge. Spotting unrealistic delivery timelines promised by consulting firms is another one. Brilliant point. And in fact, if this topic or if this conversation were focused on how to avoid failure in the first place during the planning stages, that would be one of the things I'd say is the unrealistic timelines that technology consultants and vendors put in front of clients is oftentimes borderline ridiculous. The assumptions are inaccurate. They've lowballed the estimate to try and win the business, and they've tried to convince you that the project's going to be a lot easier than it really is. And that's a sales tactic. It works. It sells software, but what it does is it leaves the customers holding the bag at the end of the day with a troubled project. They've already bought the software. They're in knee deep into an implementation. By the time they realize that the project was never going to finish on time or on budget because the budget and plan were completely unrealistic. So really good point. I'm sure, Friday, I couldn't agree with you more. Here's a question that I'm going to table for now. It's a really good one, but I want to come back to it because we're going to pepper this throughout the conversation. But Christina on LinkedIn says, please tell us your opinion on how AI will affect system and digital transformation. And I'll come back to this, but I will say that AI, this is another great point, by the way, because AI, in theory, should be helping dramatically decrease the time and cost to do some of the technical activities related to a digital transformation. And this is a really interesting one because when you deal with these bigger consulting firms whose whole business model is based on that body shop mentality, in other words, the more bodies I can put on a project, the more hours I can bill, the more money I'm going to make. That's one of the conflicts of interest as well. In that I think, on one hand, you see these big consulting firms that are embracing AI and giving it lip service, but yet in our experience, what we're seeing is we're not seeing a material drop in the level of effort that's put into these projects. If anything, it's creating more opportunities or more excuses to put more bodies on the project because now we've got AI capabilities that the clients are trying to deploy. Therefore, we need more bodies, more people to help set up those AI capabilities. So we'll see over time if that changes. I think the market will demand it. In fact, there was an article, I believe it was based out of Europe. I might have the region wrong. I believe it was in Europe. And there was a company that had publicized or had a well-publicized situation where they went to, I believe it was PwC. If it wasn't PwC, it was one of the big four consulting firms. And they went to PwC and said, hey, we expect you to start sharing some of these cost savings that you're touting as a result of AI. We expect you to pass that on to us because we're not seeing a decrease in cost, but yet you're sitting here telling us about how great AI is and how you have all these unique AI tools. And that's something that we do with our AI tool, by the way, that we use at Third Stage Consulting. We have something called Mission Control AI. And the whole idea is to help automate and speed up some of the work that has historically been done manually by the big system integrators. And they don't necessarily like this model because it does two things. One is it reduces costs and reduces the need for rework and for manual documentation, manual analysis for all the work. I mean, you still have to have humans thinking and using their brains, of course, but a lot of the manual work that consulting firms have done in the past is at risk. And so we use that tool as a way for our clients to save money. But more importantly, what that AI tool does in our implementations with our clients anyway, is it puts the client back in charge. So in other words, they now are the focal point or the center of gravity around all the requirements definition or gathering that's come into the tool, all the information that's captured, all the deliverables that come out of it. Now all of a sudden the client is more in charge of the project and they have more ownership rather than looking, wondering what's going on behind the curtain with the big consulting firms, because historically they haven't been very transparent with what they do with their time, how they do the work, how efficient they are or aren't. And again, whenever you have a party or a contractor that you've hired that is actually incentivized to be inefficient and to spend as much time and money as possible, that's not their time and money, it's your time and money. That's a definite conflict of interest. So I think AI has a way, or will have a way over time if used appropriately. It will be a way for organizations to be more smart with how they use consultants and not having to be overly dependent on them. Other comments here that really good ones. What is a major outcome of digital transformation? That's a whole conversation. We could spend a whole session just on that one topic. So great question from Muslim on YouTube. The main outcome of digital transformation should be business value. But as we're discussing here today, most organizations can't get to that point because they can't even get the base functionality or the base operational stability they need out of these new systems. So on one hand, organizations, when they're being sold software solutions, they're sold this vision, this utopia of the way things could be. But in reality, what happens is they have so much trouble just automating what they already had that oftentimes organizations never get past that. They never get past that first phase or that base level of capability that leads them to spend a lot of money essentially just automating what they've already always done, and they don't get that business value either because they run out of budget, they run out of time, they run out of patience, they run out of enough employee morale to support the project, whatever the case may be. So there's a big disconnect between what the main outcome of digital transformation should be versus what it really is. And this is the age-old challenge that organizations have faced and that this industry has faced. And again, that's why we're talking today about what to do about it. How do we assess and identify those challenges? There's a great point or comment here from TD on YouTube from Atlanta, Georgia. TD says, major airline justifying ROI for initial securing of funding. Our recent success in getting beyond that hurdle has come in showing a modular implementation plan. It's a great point. And when you say modular, I assume you mean phased, but I'd love to hear more about that if you're willing to share what you mean by modular implementation plan. But it sounds like you're saying some sort of incremental, not big bang, not all at once, but incrementally improving technology, which I think is a very smart way to de-risk the project. And I think you just answered the question for me before I asked it. So TD followed up on YouTube, says addressing very specific business challenges with obvious high value return, and then implementing parts of the larger system solution to realize quick and early value. So thank you for your feedback there. So great comments so far, great discussion, and thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts so far. And please keep the conversation going here in the chat while I get started on a couple of thoughts here. But the first step, if we're looking at the steps you would go through to get a project back on track, the first thing is to admit there's a problem. And this may sound like a no-brainer, but it is really interesting to me how organizational dynamics and organizational psychology can get in the way of common sense. And what I mean by that is a lot of times organizations have a few things that come together that converge to create this perfect storm of denial. And the reasons for that are, one is oftentimes organizations don't understand, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know what a digital transformation should look like. They don't know what a complete project plan looks like versus not. They don't know what a realistic project plan looks like. They don't understand that your software vendor is just one cog in the machine. They don't need to be, nor should they be, the ones owning and running the entire project. Yet that's how most organizations manage the projects, is they allow the software vendors and their implementation technical partners to be the ones to control the entire project. And I would submit to you that it should be you, the organization, that controls and owns the project. The software vendor is just one of many pieces of that overall program, and they need to be managed just as much as anyone. And in fact, I would argue they need to be managed more than anyone on the project because they are the biggest culprit of cost overrun, time overruns, all that stuff. And so you need a overall PMO or program manager in place to manage everything. But the reality is most organizations don't know that because they don't know what they don't know. They haven't been through projects like these often. You add to the fact a second factor, which is that people are generally excited for the project, especially early on. They want to move forward. They want to see progress. They want to believe and hope for the best. And when problems start to arise, it can be easy to, at least for a certain period of time, it can be easy to ignore those problems and keep the faith, keep the optimism, all that stuff, which is great. You don't want people to get demoralized, of course, but there's a fine line between optimism and blind optimism and pragmatic, realistic optimism. Those are very different things, and organizations just aren't good at finding that right balance. And then I'd say the third factor, which I think is the biggest problem, and the thing that drives me the most crazy about this industry, is that you have software vendors, you have technical implementation partners, you have tech consultants that that fuel into that continue to make you believe things are fine when they're not. There's so many times we see remediation projects, a big part of our business. In fact, a majority of our revenue now as a company comes from troubled or remediation projects, including expert witness. So we do a lot of expert witness work where it's gotten so bad that it's gotten to a lawsuit phase, and we have to go in and do the forensic analysis of why the project failed. But setting that aside, the expert witness stuff aside, so much of our business now is remediation. And when you're doing these remediation projects, you go back and look at what went wrong. One of the early culprits, and it continues throughout the entire project, is you had a technology partner who was convincing you that everything is fine. And part of this is lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of the reality of business, because a lot of these tech consulting firms are so myopically focused on deploying technology that all they can see is through the lens of whether or not the technology works. And when I say works, I mean it works technically. It's sound, it's the workflows are working, the data flows, it's integrated to other systems, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is great. That doesn't mean it's going to work for your business. It could be a complete unmitigated disaster, even if they've done a great job designing and building the software from a technical perspective, because they don't understand your business. And what's even worse is that they're not the ones that have to live with the operational consequences of a failed project. Again, they could deliver a working system that meets all the technical specifications, but you can't run your business. And for the first few weeks after go live, you just can't ship product, or you can't close the books, you can't run payroll. And it's not because the software doesn't work, it's because it wasn't deployed effectively for your organization. All the exceptions weren't worked out, people weren't trained appropriately, all that stuff. So that third dimension, that third component of software vendors, technical implementers, those parties add to the confusion by trying to convince clients that everything is fine when in fact they're not. There's so many times we hear consulting firms, the technical consulting firms, that are really in CYA mode. It's like they're trying to protect their image, their perception, whatever, and they're trying to deflect blame, saying, "Hey, everything's going great. This is normal. Just relax." Because the last thing they want is for you to question enough to where you might stop the project, you might slow down the project, you might look for another system integrator because you're not happy with them, whatever it is. So they're always in CYA mode, especially the larger ones. And I came from that background. I came from a very large Big Four consulting firm back in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And I was part of that gamesmanship that would happen behind the scenes. And it's very crafty. I mean, it's very crafty. It's very effective. It's very deliberate. It's what I would say very conniving. It's very manipulative. And it's definitely designed to protect self-interest, which is completely counter to what clients need, which clients need to know that there's a problem. And again, it's not that you need to be overly negative. You don't want to create unnecessary alarm. You don't want people to get demoralized more than they might already be. But you also have to be smart and say, look, we've got some problems here and we've got to address them. We can't just stick our head in the sand and trust the guy or gal who's the partner at the big system integration firm telling you that everything's fine. They're the experts, they know. when they've got nothing to gain by you being successful. I mean, it sucks to say, but they actually benefit. The longer they can milk this project, the longer they can extend it, get some more change orders, be there for you to clean up the problems that they created. They actually benefit from that. And that's the dynamic that we've got to watch. So admitting there's a problem is the first step. And what I would say is if you're going through digital transformation, admit there is a problem. There probably is a problem that you're not aware of. So dig in and try and understand. And you do this in a way not based out of fear, but just based out of logic and using your brain and using common sense and saying, look, these are nasty, complicated projects, right? They're not fun. They're not easy. They never are. So let's just go in admitting that that's just what we signed up for. So now let's be realistic. Let's figure it out. It'd be like, if you're this is probably a bad analogy. I've never been a paramedic or a firefighter or anything like that, or a ER doctor. But if you're one of those people that are in business or your profession is to help people out of trauma or to help people from a fire, to put out a fire, whatever it is, it's not a bad thing to say there's a problem, there is a fire, or this person is in need of medical attention now. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing to say, look, we need to fix this. We need to fix it now. We're not going to panic. We're not going to be unreasonably freaked out, but we are going to be smart about it. And we're going to try to address it. So admitting there's a problem is the first step. And again, denial is a very powerful thing. And it's one of the things that gets companies into trouble. So back to the audience here real quickly. Abul on LinkedIn says, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today, Abul. TD on YouTube clarified my question earlier when I asked him to clarify what he meant by modular. So he said, yes, it's a phased approach. So thank you for that. Mohammed on LinkedIn says, for an on-premise ERP, what do you propose for an AI agent solution? AI agent using N8N or OpenAI agent, build your own on-premise AI integrated with our local database, ? Great question. I'm going to defer to anyone in the audience that might want to answer that because I'm not a good, credible source of an answer for that as far as specific AI solutions or the specific architecture for AI. But I think it's a great question because, and I bring it up knowing I can't answer it. I brought it up anyway, because I figure someone in the audience might have some thoughts on it, but also because it's a great question and a great reminder that there are so many different ways to get AI that don't require you to necessarily rip out and replace your entire back office infrastructure. And when you look at the messaging from SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, all these big tech vendors, a lot of them are trying to convince you that you need to upgrade to their solution so that you can get AI. And, of course, that's another self-interest driven motive to say, hey, if we can get more people to completely sign up for our solution, not only the cloud solution that's our flagship, but also AI, then that's the utopia that software vendors want. But the reality is you have third-party options too. If you've got a legacy system that's working fine, but you want AI, then go find AI. There's ways to do that. And we've got clients that have done it. I just can't tell you the specific architecture or tools that each are using, but this is a really good question and just it's a good question, a good line of thinking, because that's what more organizations should be doing. It's not, you don't necessarily need to say, okay, well, I'm going to go all in with SAP because they've got, Joule, their AI solution. So I'm going to upgrade S4HANA and put in Joule just so I can get AI. You don't necessarily need that. If you're an existing SAP user, like an ECC user, and you don't want to upgrade S4HANA, but you want AI, you can get AI without upgrading S4HANA. In fact, I would argue that's the lower cost, lower risk, higher value path, because now you don't have to go through the heartache and all the heartburn of all the other crap that leads you up to maybe someday, possibly getting AI if that project ever gets off the ground, because these projects are so challenging. So Bipin says on LinkedIn, Bipin says 1, acceptance of the problem, and 2 is user adoption. So yes, we will get to user adoption as well. Great points there, and I appreciate you sharing that. And here's a nice comment from B-Boy on YouTube. B-Boy says, sir, you are superb, outstanding. Your thought process and coaching content is just phenomenal. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And any other thoughts or questions you have, I'd love to hear from you here. And so we talked about the first step, which is admitting there's a problem. And sounds basic enough, but like I said, most organizations don't do it very well. and most don't do it at all, I would say. But the next step is to assess the current situation. And this is where it gets tricky because when we go into a client and they call us and they say, "Hey, third stage consulting, we need you to come in and take a look at this project because something doesn't feel right. We don't know what it is. We're being told one thing by the software vendor or by the system integrator, but things just aren't adding up in our heads, and we want you to come in and assess." Well, first of all, I'll say that when you bring in someone to assess, and when I say bring in someone, it could be someone internal, it could be a third party consulting firm like us, it could be anyone you might bring in to assess a project. The technical vendors generally don't like that because they want to protect their turf. They view it as their projects. They've got their cash cow to protect. And this statement is true. The bigger company you are and the bigger revenue generator you are for the technical vendors, the more this is true, is that they're going to do whatever they can to protect that cash cow and that revenue stream. So if you're a bigger company, you're more at risk of seeing this, and those companies will fight super, super hard to make sure that companies like Third Stage Consulting stay the hell away, because the last thing they want is someone coming in and digging in and identifying problems and warts and things that aren't being done right, and things that are leading you, the client, astray because they've got their own agenda that they're pursuing, their own self-interest agenda that they're pursuing. But you still need to assess the situation. I think this is where you've got to use a lot of finesse. I think this is something our team is really good at. We don't come in like a wrecking ball and start pointing fingers and throwing blame around or trying to threaten anyone's turf. Nothing like that. But there's a lot of defensiveness that comes along with troubled projects. A lot of protecting your image, the CYA, cover your ass mentality. And so again, that creates a bit of a smoke screen where it's hard to see past that. It's hard to see past, well, it doesn't feel right, but they're telling me this is normal. I get these status reports every week and everything's green. Yeah, there's a couple of yellows, but they say they've got it under control. That's what it says on paper on these status reports. But I look over here and what's happening on the front lines, and it looks like a complete disaster. Well, first of all, I'd say, again, back to my point number one, admit there's a problem, go with your gut. Chances are you're probably right because usually there are challenges on these projects. And usually by the time you recognize that there are challenges, typically what we found is that the challenges and the issues and the risks are a lot greater than you realize. So if you're starting to feel like there's something there, chances are not only that you're right, but you're probably underestimating what those challenges really are and what the risks really are. So the finesse part of this comes in to play where you've got to assess the current situation in a way that is transparent. I mean, you need to have complete transparency when you're doing these assessments. But the other tricky part is oftentimes when we do these, and most of the time, I'd say 80 or 90% of the time we do these current state assessments of the project, you don't want to stop the whole thing yet. And you may never want to stop the whole thing completely. You want to keep momentum going. You want to keep hitting milestones and keep going. And these current state assessments, by the way, should not be long. They should be quick hit, very fast while the project's happening in parallel. Now, occasionally we'll get a client who's completely paused the project because they just know it's a complete disaster, and they'll pause it and then have us come in and figure out what the hell's going on and how do we fix it. But that's a minority of the time. Usually there's a problem in progress. It's not great enough necessarily to pause, but there's definitely not a sustainable path that they're on. So they'll try and figure out a way to keep everything intact as much as possible while this assessment is going on, while the current situation is being assessed. And so, you want to assess that current situation in a way that looks at all the different angles of the project. You also have to remember that if you decide you want the situation assessed, there's no one that should be able to tell you no, that it's not a good idea. They may try to, of course, but if your technology vendor is telling you it's not a good idea, you should not bring in someone or have someone do an assessment of the current situation. That is a huge, huge red flag. Why not? Like if you're doing a good job with this project, have at it. Bring in someone if you want. Good idea. Maybe if anything else validates how great of a job we're doing, and you're going to feel even more confident in our services. But that's not usually what happens. What usually happens is technology vendors feel threatened. They say, no, don't do this assessment. We've got this. We don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, blah, blah, blah. They'll give you a million reasons why you shouldn't do it. But you do need to assess the current situation. You need to do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the current project. And you need to do it in a way that is not overly threatening or more threatening than it's already going to be, to not only your third party providers, but also your internal team too. Your internal team presumably takes a lot of pride in the project. They want to do a good job. They want to be told they're doing a good job. So inviting someone to assess the project and tell them that maybe they're not doing a great job, that's just human nature. That can be threatening. So doing it in a way that's not threatening or any more threatening than it already is really important. But you do need to assess the current situation. As far as how you do the assessment of the current situation, we have a whole 13-point quality assurance framework that we use at third stage that we've developed over the years. And it's actually the same framework we use for our expert witness cases. In fact, that's where we developed it, is we developed this framework to analyze expert witness cases to say these are the things that we need to analyze in a failed project to understand all the dimensions of a project, where the risks were and why they're contributing or how they're contributing to the failure. And we use that same framework when we're assessing current state projects as well, or assessing client projects that are in flight with their digital transformations. We'll use that same framework there as we do in expert witness. And the good thing with that is it's battle tested. It's been used in some pretty gnarly extreme failures. And so being able to bring that forward to a troubled project that hasn't quite gotten to that failure point yet can be very powerful in a very structured way of analyzing the project. Not only is it structured too, it's very objective. It's meant to be agnostic. It's meant to be not personal. It's just meant to be looking at the reality of what's going well, what's not, and what do we need to pivot on and improve or fix to put out some of the fires that you might be experiencing in these projects. So I can come back to the audience real quick and see what kind of questions you have here. Um, James on LinkedIn says, is there a common theme with a specific enterprise system, such as SAP, Oracle, Dynamics, etc., often leading to increased likelihood of failure and delays? This is a great question. I get asked this a lot. And I do struggle a little bit to answer it because I have such mixed feelings on it. On one hand, I'll admit I'm a bit jaded with SAP and Oracle because, especially SAP, that's where you see most of the biggest, most gnarliest failures, the most expensive disasters in the history of enterprise tech typically involve SAP or Oracle. But take that with a grain of salt, because by definition or by design, most of SAP and Oracle's customers are really big companies that if they're going to fail in their projects, they're going to fail spectacularly because they're such big companies. And you're going to see huge price tags, like hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases over $1 billion spent and lost on a failed digital transformation. And when it's a publicly traded company or a public institution that people have heard of, you're just going to hear about it more. And it's a lot more likely to be a big deal than the average, small mom and pop manufacturing shop down the street that no one's ever heard of. And it is not going to fail nearly as spectacularly, but for them, relatively speaking, it can still be a complete disaster and enough to, in some cases, put them out of business. But generally, you don't hear about that in the same way you hear about the big SAP and Oracle failures. So that's the caveat I'd say is, yes, there are, I'd say, more big dramatic SAP and Oracle failures than anything, but I couldn't tell you how much of that is due to the software as it is the nature of the customers. I will say, though, that the problem with SAP and Oracle, and I'd say this is just as a broad generalization, it's not always true, but as a broad generalization, the bigger the technical vendor you're working with, the more likely it is that they're not going to have a bad product necessarily. They probably have a better project. I mean, you could argue that SAP has one of the best ERP systems in the world. I know many of you will agree with that, and I'm sure many of you will strongly just disagree with this. And I'm not here to talk about the merits of SAP versus Oracle versus Dynamics, but what I will say is that the problems that happen in a big SAP project are not nearly as much related to the technology itself as it is the nature of the way those projects are managed. And a lot of the dynamics I just talked about with big SAP partners who have a big cash cow to protect, it creates a ton of really unhealthy, destructive behavior that leads to failure more commonly, because not because the software sucks or because the system can't handle what the client needs, but because of all the other stuff I just mentioned, all that the conflicts of interest, the gamesmanship that goes into protecting turf and protecting cash cows and things like that. That's the stuff that leads to failure. And so again, that's more of a function of the fact that these are big organizations that have created a juggernaut of a sales engine to basically sell as much software as possible. So great question there. Um, there's a comment from Laik on LinkedIn. Laik says, "Whoa, my favorite topic. ECC equals expose you APA, aka OData services, and use third-party AI models and agents. Believe me, it's your best option if you can't justify the ROI on an S4 HANA upgrade." So Lake has a couple solutions there that might be good alternatives. Um, and then here's a really interesting question from Amar. Amar says, "Is there a way to prepare for a rescue plan from day zero?" It's a great point. I don't know that I would necessarily call it a rescue plan from day zero because there's nothing to rescue yet, and you don't want to necessarily prematurely worry the masses, if you will. If you're an executive, sure, let's talk about this behind closed doors. That yes, this is going to be challenging. It's going to be gnarly. You probably will have to rescue some things, but that's generally not the message you lead with when you're trying to convince your team and your broader support system on the project. You don't want to you want them to be realistic. You want to be realistic and let them know what they're getting into, but you don't want to freak them out too much. So it's a tricky thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a rescue plan, but it's more of a risk mitigation plan from day zero. So the key here is how do you set up objective, transparent, and realistic risk mitigation from day zero? That's the trick here. And the dynamic that you're touching upon here, Amar, is that again, in true CYA fashion, if I'm the vendor, if I'm the technical implementer, if I'm the system integrator, I'm probably more likely to put a status report out that has way too much green on it and not nearly enough yellow and red. Red, yellow, green, being green's good. Green means things are on track. Red means we've got problems. We've got to fix these right away, et cetera, et cetera. Because it's almost like it's almost like a scorecard that you're doing for yourself in many cases. And this is where the saying, you don't want the fox guarding the hen house, because it'd be like in school. It'd be like when you were in school or university, there's a reason that you're not asked to grade your own homework or your own test results. You could, I mean, that might, save the university money if you did do that, but there's a reason they don't. But yet, as corporations, we rely on the information, the self-assessment information provided by our vendors and our system integrators, which is a huge problem because in that situation, you're going to get green status reports and they create a false sense of security that's not true. And I'm not saying everything needs to be yellow and red and the sky is falling and it's doomsday scenario from day one, but you need to identify those risks before you feel them, before they become obvious to you. And what we view with our clients and the way we look at it is we want to be the ones to help them see around the corner what's coming next before they run into it. If you run into it, it's too late usually by the time you get to the problem or by the time the problem materializes to the point where you see it and feel it. Generally speaking, you've gone too far. You've waited too long at that point. So great question there. So we've talked about two steps so far. We talked about admitting there's a problem. We talked about assessing the current situation. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to prioritize the risks and issues. And if you are anything beyond, actually, I'll take it back. If you are anywhere in your digital transformation journey right now, and I mean anywhere, if you're on day zero, if you're just a few weeks, a few months into it, or if you're just about to start your digital transformation, if you haven't identified risks and issues and started to see some signs of yellow and maybe even some signs of red, there's something you're missing. You're not seeing the full picture. You're not seeing below the tip of the iceberg right now. And so there's going to be risks and issues. That is not um, that's not really a debatable fact, in my opinion. You are going to have risk and issues no matter who you are, no matter what vendor or partners you're working with. I'd love to say even if you hire if you hire third stage, though, you'll have no risk or issues. You're going to have risk and issues no matter who you hire. The question is, how quickly do you recognize them? How do you prioritize them? And how do you mitigate them? And so prioritizing the risk and issues is important because oftentimes the further you are into the project, the bigger this list is. And oftentimes we go into these projects and there's 100 things that you should be doing differently and better. You should have done from day one, but you didn't. And you should fix all 100 of these things. Well, the reality is you're probably not going to fix all 100 of them anytime soon. So let's pick the 10 or 20 that are going to have a huge impact to at least stabilize things, at least get us on the right track to where we can then work our way down the list and start chipping away at some of the other challenges. And so prioritizing those risks and issues, and again, doing this in an objective way is really important because again, the dynamic we see in these sorts of projects is that oftentimes the technical vendor will, even if let's just say they do identify the risk or they agree that there is a risk, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll understate or underestimate the significance of that risk. Something like, well, yeah, half the team isn't trained yet, but that's okay. That's normal. Most of the learning comes after go live anyway. Something like that. On the surface, maybe you think, okay, well, maybe that's true. Maybe that's just the way things should be. And so maybe it's really a yellow and it's not a red. It's just more of a yellow. It's something to be aware of, but it's fine. We've got it under control. Well, it could be that, if your half your team isn't trained and you're going live next week, I would say that is absolutely double, triple red status. And so you want to objectively prioritize those risks and issues and be realistic about it. And again, having a third party assess those risks in a way that isn't grading your own homework is really important because you the end client have to be aware. And you could decide that maybe you don't think it's as big of a risk, but if you consciously decide that yourself and you make a smart objective business decision, that's fine. That's different. And we're used to that as consultants. We're used to the business realities of you have a business to run. You can't address every single thing that should be done in a project, but you at least need to know what they are, and you at least need to make a risk adjusted decision with full information. And that's the key right there, is that most of the time executives are making these decisions without complete or unbiased information. So very important thing to keep in mind there. So let me go back to the chat here. Darian on LinkedIn asked the question, what is the first step when your gut says something is wrong? Well, great question. I'd say the first step is to validate that something probably is wrong. And again, think that it's probably worse than you think. If you're feeling it, chances are super high that there's something there. And so dig into it, listen to your gut, dig into it. Doesn't mean you need to, throw the baby out with the bathwater and call a timeout on the whole thing or whatever. But just be smart about and deliberate and really dig into what that is and get that objective view of what in fact might be wrong with the project. So great question there. Here's a comment from Derek on YouTube, joining from Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for being here today, Derek, on YouTube. So we talked about step one, admit there's a problem. 2, assess the current situation. 3, prioritize the risks and issues. And then step 4 is develop a remediation strategy and plan. And this may seem straightforward enough, but again, the key here is that if you've done your analysis objectively and you've prioritized the risks objectively, now you should be able to develop a remediation strategy and plan that starts to address those things. And oftentimes, just to give you examples, some things that will happen are some common things we'll see here is that one really common one is you're not investing enough in change management. You're not getting your people on board beyond just showing them how to use a new system. You need to more fundamentally focus on how you're helping people through the change by ensuring that they understand what their jobs are going to look like, that you take the time to define what their jobs are going to look like, what their roles and responsibilities are going to be in the new system, in the new environment. And that's something that, is interesting how it doesn't get done often. It definitely doesn't get done early enough in most cases, but it's one of those pains or those risks that you don't really see and feel until after go live. And that's a really bad time to feel it. And what I mean is that, like, you could go through this competency training, you could train everyone on how to use a new system. Let's just say you're implementing Microsoft Dynamics 365. You've gone through and 98% of your people have passed the competency test, assuming you're measuring the competency levels. People can complete transactions in the system. But then you go live and all of a sudden people aren't doing it. And it's not about competency. It's about whether or not they want to, and whether or not they understand, and whether or not they can merge how to use a system with their day-to-day jobs. And that's a totally different thing. Knowing how to complete a series of tasks and transactions in a system is not what it takes to do my job. And what it takes to do my job is to understand, like, how am I going to use AI? Like, okay, I know how you train me on how to enter certain prompts or whatever, but what does that mean for me and my job? Just so taking the time to really do that job design, that work design, and help people understand what the changes are, helping them work through the shock and the concern that they might have, and they probably will have with the changes of their job. That's all really important. And that's just one example. Anything to do with change management, that's commonly an issue that we see with remediation strategies. Oftentimes we see that there's a lack of accountability on the projects with your third party vendors. So in other words, a lot of times um, people will um, they're not holding their vendors accountable. They're not managing their vendors. They're letting the vendors manage the project. And guess what? It's not their money. So sure, they want to manage it because if they can manage the project, they manage their own cash flow. So it's almost like a not a cartel situation, although I do think the tech industry as a whole is like a cartel, but that's not the word I'm looking for here. But having someone who manages and controls your cash and how you spend your time and money and resources is a problem. So you've got to oftentimes the remediation strategy and plan entails managing your vendor and putting accountability and guardrails in place for the vendor. And guess what? They're not going to like that. But for most of you, if not all of you, that's something you absolutely have to do, or else your project will run into problems. It just will. It's human nature. It's conflicts of interest. It's greed. It's self interest. All these things add up into a situation where there's only one person who's going to lose, and it's going to be you, the end client. So that's something that's super important to recognize in these projects. And so developing that remediation strategy and plan is something that's critical. Um, and you want to make sure you do that as quickly as possible. Here's a comment from Amar on LinkedIn. Amar says, generally, by the time one realizes that a project is going off track, the budget has already been largely consumed. How can this be prevented? Great question. Yes, unfortunately, most organizations wait until they've blown through the budget, they've blown past a series of milestones, and it becomes painfully obvious that we've got a problem and it's not going well. And so the key is to take responsibility, take ownership of your project from day one. Do not, and I can't emphasize it enough, do not let your system integrator or your software vendor manage the project for you. You are the project manager, you are the program manager, you are the PMO. They are one piece of that overall program. They report to you. You tell them how it's going to be. They've got their plans of what they think they need to do. They've got their tools and methodologies of what they think they need to do. You are the ones that decide whether or not and how you're going to deploy those vendors. And just to give you an example, if you've got a software vendor that says, and actually we have a client who's going through an SAP project, they're just ramping it up right now, and it's with not a huge big four consulting firm, but it's a solid, larger, mid-tier SAP implementer. The client signed the contract with them, and the amount of pressure that this implementer put on them to staff the project with 30 full-time resources ASAP was just unbelievable to me. Before the client had their own team in place, before the client had their ducks in a row, before they even knew what the full scope of the project was, this vendor was saying, hey, we need to start our team of 30 full-time people in 2 weeks, or else this project is at risk. And that's how they get you, is they'll tell you, well, you want to hit your timeline, right? You want to finish this on budget, right? Well, you better let us throw a bunch of bodies at it. And again, if and when you don't get the budget anyway, because you've wasted and burned a lot of time with unnecessary resources too early in the project, again, the only one that's hurt by it is you, and the person that benefits is actually the person who convinced you to do something that hurts you. So again, if that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is, but that's the dynamic you have to watch for. And so you don't want to wait until the project gets over track, over budget. You want to put guardrails and PMO, program governance in place, and management of the system integrator early on, because it's a lot harder to change that later. If you let them do what they want and run amok with the project, 6, 12, 18 months into the project, it's really hard to undo that. So you can, because you're a business. If you need to fire them, you can, or whatever, but that's a little dramatic. You might as well just work through that expectation setting early on from day one, so that you can objectively see the time and money that's being spent on projects. So um, that's what I would say is manage the project. Put a PMO in place. If you don't have your own internal PMO, get it from the outside. Get someone who's objective that's not affiliated with the technology or the software vendor, because again, they're the ones that are going to consume and suck up all the time and money, when in fact a lot of that time and money should be dispersed to other work streams, things like change management and training and the architecture and integration of other systems. Maybe you have third party systems you want to deploy. You need to make sure that you're deploying capital and resources and time appropriately throughout the program, not letting one vendor within the overall program suck up all that time and money, that doesn't benefit you at all. So we've talked about 4 steps so far. There's 1 step left, and well, it's not really a step. I talked about how you develop a remediation strategy and plan. You're not going to boil the ocean overnight. You're not going to fix everything overnight. Um, you want to make sure you're getting to the root causes of what's really causing the problem, and it could lead to a whole spectrum or a whole continuum of options. It ranges from, hey, we're just got minor little incremental improvements we want to make to slowly get this thing back on track. In some cases it could be more extreme than that, and that's the fifth thing that I'll talk about, is that don't be afraid to pause or stop the project. um it is somewhat of a last resort. I wouldn't suggest it as a going in strategy or as a option A. But for some of you, it may be that you do need to pause or stop the project, even if it's just temporarily, even if it's for 30 days, while you get your house in order, while you reorganize the team, while you reorganize the plan, recast the plan. The last thing you want to do is find that, oh, we've got all these problems and we're going down this path that's the complete wrong path. We're just going to keep doing it, and we're just going to keep blowing money and bleeding money out this way, knowing that we've got to pivot and go this other direction. So for some organizations, when it's that extreme where you are completely off track and your vendor's off doing their own thing and you've got to redirect them, sometimes you just have to pause it, and they will absolutely kick and scream and resist that so heavily, because again, they've got a cash cow to protect. And if they've put 30 or 50 full-time people on this project, that's 30 or 50 people now they've got to figure out what to do with. And of course, they're going to tell you, don't do it. We may not get these resources back, and you'll lose all that tribal knowledge, and we'll lose all the momentum we built. Well, it doesn't matter if the momentum and the tribal knowledge was taking you down the wrong path anyway. So you can set that aside. That's a non-issue. But there are times where you may need to pause the project, and a good partner will understand that. And a good partner will actually help you through that and encourage you to do that to make sure you get things right. A self-interested partner will say, don't do it. Keep, hold the course, just hang in there. This is normal. Everything's fine. Because again, their stopgap and their solution is a change order. All they need to do is say, well, yeah, things are going to be fine. We just need a change order to fix it. Um, and you shouldn't be the one paying for your vendor's mistakes or their lack of accountability for the project. So, I think that's the key. And it's really not about stopping or pausing the project. I think the point here is much, much bigger than this. And it's a point I made a few minutes ago, and that is you are in control of your project. I know, it may sound, as I say it, it sounds like such common sense. Of course, it's your project. It's your company, right? You're the one putting in new technology to do something to improve your business. Of course, you're in charge of it. But the tech industry has done a really good job of selling software by creating these weird codependent learned helplessness sorts of relationships with customers, to where again they benefit the more helpless you are, and they benefit the harder the project is for you, the more they benefit. And they're really good at convincing you that, hey, it's fine. It's almost like they're gaslighting you into believing that everything's fine. Maybe you're the problem. I mean, they're not. You just need to get your shit together, and then everything will be fine. But they're good. Everything they're doing is fine. You just need to find more people, or do your deliverables faster. And so there are times, though, you need to pause or stop the project. There's times where you may need to fire your system integrator and say, this is not working. You need someone that's smaller, more nimble, someone who's a little more focused, someone who's not going to blow your budget so quickly. You may need a focus on other work streams that you've neglected this whole time. So it could be that, the tech stuff is moving along fine. The design and build is moving along fine, but all the other stuff's falling behind as far as the integration of other systems, the integration testing, the training, the change management, the process improvement. If those are the cases, then, or if that is the case, then don't keep spending money at the current run rate while you're trying to fix those things because you're just wasting more money. The other option too, beyond just stopping the project, by the way, is that you can also slow it down. And that's something we've seen several clients do very effectively over the years is that, if let's just say, just for round number purposes, you're spending $1 million a month on a project and you're assuming a 18-month implementation, it might be that, it's actually more like a 24-month implementation. So we're going to throttle that back to, 700,000 a month. And by the way, vendor and integrator, we need you to cut back your resources and right size your delivery of the project. And of course, they'll kick and scream and tell you that's a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. We can get it done in 18 months. Just trust us. If you just let us do our job, you're not going to get it done in 18 months. It's going to be 24 or whatever the number is. So just right size your project accordingly. Doesn't matter that they staffed it up heavier at one point. You might have to scale it back. In fact, ideally, you do that from day one. You start off slow, and if you need to add more bodies, then sure, add bodies. But it's a lot easier to add bodies as you go and start slow and start smart than it is to throttle back and reverse course later. So, but having said that, in some cases, um, not being afraid to stop the project, pause it, completely right size it, downsize the project and the run rate if need be. And it's not about whether or not you want to go faster or slower. A lot of times it's just you can't. And if you can't, then don't, don't spend money and go at that run rate, assuming you're going to hit some aggressive timeline that you just never going to hit. Because guess what? That run rate's going to continue into perpetuity until you do finish, which could be 25, 50, 75% beyond what they originally promised you. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as you go through these sorts of projects. So those are the steps I've got for you here today. Love to hear any feedback you have, any other comments you have. But those are the things to keep in mind when you're trying to rescue a digital transformation. I know there's a lot to think about. I'd love to hear your comments or feedback as far as what you've seen work best or some of the challenges you're facing with your project right now. I know there's a lot of you that are going through these projects, and maybe you're struggling with in some parts of the project now. Maybe you're not sure, but I think the key here, the main takeaway I'd leave you with is first of all, you're not crazy. If you're running into trouble and you're having issues with your digital transformation, you're not crazy and you're not alone. So that's the good news. You're actually in the majority. Most companies going through these projects um, have that problem. And in fact, whenever we do these mastermind groups or we get together our clients, our C-level clients to to collaborate or just to meet, or when we do our stratosphere events in person, one of the biggest values that in those events that we find isn't the knowledge and the wisdom that we impart on our clients, although I'd love to say that's the most valuable important thing. It's not. What's even more important is just being around people like yourselves that are going through the same thing, realizing, oh, they're struggling with a lot of the same things and I'm not crazy. And a lot of times I actually get that comment a lot from clients, especially new clients. They'll say, I can't tell you how many times I've heard the comment like, Eric, or third stage, you must think we're crazy. Are you sure you want to work with us? And we look at it as like, you're actually not crazy at all. And that's the only crazy thing in this industry is that it's not crazy. It's normal, which that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother time. I think it's a very broken industry that stacks the odds against customers. And I don't know of necessarily of any other industry where you could say that. If anyone has a good example, I'd love to hear it because I've struggled for 25 years to find an industry where the entire thing is stacked to basically harm customers, not intentionally, but it's the way it's designed. It does harm customers and it benefits the tech industry really well. I mean, look at the valuations of all these companies I've mentioned here today. They have incredible valuations on the stock market. Their stock prices are high, especially SAP and Oracle. They're doing really well financially. I mean, they are living the dream, but their customers are not. And there's so many customers for these same high valued tech companies. They're miserable right now. They're bleeding cash. They're going through extreme operational hardship as a result of failed or failing digital transformations. And so some people say I'm too negative when I say that stuff. I just think it's the reality. It's unfortunately, it's why I do what I do, is because I want to help clients figure this out for themselves and help them get through it, because it doesn't need to be this way. But the way the ecosystem was built for each of these big software vendors, it was built to sell a massive amount of software, and it is highly scalable. Investors love it. They get rewarded for it. And even when they do fail, they get rewarded for it through additional services. So it's the only industry I can think of where there's a actual pretty significant financial incentive to harm your clients, even if it's not intentional. So that's the bad news. The good news is it's your project, your company, your project. Do what you need to do. If you want to talk to me or anyone from our team, even if it was informally, just want to bounce around ideas, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat with you at any point and give you some ideas on how to get your project back on track. Love to share our experiences with you as well. So be sure um, to do that if you'd like. I've included my contact information below. And also one other thing, I have a book out now called Welcome to the Jungle. It's my second book. And in that book, I talk about digital transformation failure case studies and the lessons from those digital transformations so that you can get those projects back on track. So you can find that on Amazon anywhere in the world you are. You can get it electronically, or you can get hard copy paperback versions of the book anywhere in the world. So be sure to order that right here, scan the QR code, or if you just go to Amazon, search my name, Welcome to the Jungle. There's like a kid's book called Welcome to the Jungle, but other than that, I think mine's the only one called that on Amazon. But you can find that there, and it's I'm proud of it. I think it's a good book that talks a lot about some of the high profile failures in digital transformations. And as you read the book, the idea is that you start to see the same patterns over and over and over again. And it doesn't matter what era we're talking. We could have been talking about a failure in the 90s. We could have been talking about a failure this year. And the patterns and the failure points and the mistakes organizations make has not changed, in my opinion, over the last 25 years. So that book really outlines what these big companies do wrong, the things they could have and should have done, and the things you certainly can do to avoid failure in the first place. So be sure to check that out. Welcome to the Jungle, my second book. So be sure to check that out. So thank you for joining today. Hope you enjoyed the content. We'll be back same time, same place next week. This discussion will get edited. We'll add some additional content to make it a formal episode of Transformation Ground Control, which is my weekly podcast that comes out every Wednesday. So keep an eye out in the next couple of weeks for the episode featuring this discussion. So thank you for being here today as part of the live production of that podcast. So hope you have a great week. Look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week in the meantime, and take care. We'll see.